Chapter 1. Pine and Possibility. Jason Cornell liked mornings best when the world hadn't quite decided what it was going to be yet. There was a softness to the air in his part of the countryside, a patient quiet that felt like a held breath before laughter. It reminded him of his classroom before the first student arrived, untouched, brimming with potential, waiting for imagination to wake it up. That Saturday carried that same quiet promise. The hum of his riding mower cut through the stillness, mechanical but oddly soothing. He guided it in neat, overlapping lines across the grass that connected his modest home to the neighboring property of Carl and Margaret Jameson. The arrangement hadn't been spoken so much as accepted. Carl couldn't move easily these days, and Jason didn't mind. It felt good to be useful without making a fuss about it. Carl would have hated making a fuss. The old man had been stubborn long before gravity intervened. Now, with a leg encased in plaster and irritation simmering just beneath the surface, he was even more particular about not being pitted. Jason respected that. It was the kind of quiet dignity that teachers recognized when they saw it, strength not worn loudly, but carried naturally. Jason steered the mower toward the back of the Jameson property, where the land stretched into something larger than expected. The manicured yard ended at a casual boundary marked by shade and scattered pine needles, transitioning into a forest that seemed less owned and more borrowed from the earth itself. He was halfway through his final pass when he noticed her. Susan Jameson sat on the back steps, elbows on her knees, looking not at anything in particular but through something unseen. The posture struck him. Not dramatic, not even visibly distressed, but deeply still. There was a kind of stillness that came from rest, and another that came from being paused against one's will. Hers looked like the latter. For a moment, Jason considered letting the noise of the mower announce his presence and nothing more. He had no intention of intruding on something private. But then she lifted her head. Their eyes met. It was brief, maybe a second, but it held longer in the way unexpected moments often did. There was strength there, he noticed that first. A quiet, grounded kind of resilience, but it was threaded with something heavier, something worn. Jason slowed the mower, disengaged the blade, and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt louder than the machine had been. He climbed off and brushed his hands over his jeans out of habit before walking toward her. "Hey!" he called gently as he approached, keeping his tone neutral, unassuming. "How's your dad holding up?" Susan blinked, as if pulling herself back from wherever she had been. "Oh, he's managing," she said, a small smile flickering, polite but tired. "Complaining, mostly." Jason chuckled. "That sounds about right. If he stops complaining, I'd be worried." She huffed something close to a laugh. "You're not wrong." He nodded toward the yard behind him. "Figured I'd take care of this while I was out. Gives him less to argue about." "That's really kind of you," she said, looking at him more directly now. "It's just neighbor stuff," he replied with an easy shrug. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but hanging with something unspoken. Jason shifted slightly, preparing to head back to his mower. It felt like the natural end of the interaction. Then she spoke again. It came out softer, not quite directed at him. "I'm just trying to figure everything out." Jason stopped. He didn't interrupt. He didn't fill the silence. Years of teaching had taught him that sometimes the most important thing wasn't what you said. It was whether you gave someone room to continue. "I thought I had things under control," she went on, still looking toward the yard. "But it feels like no matter what I do, I'm always one step behind. Like I'm missing something obvious." He turned back fully now, walking the few steps to the bottom of the stairs and sitting down on the edge of the picnic bench nearby. Not too close, not too far. She exhaled, shaking her head lightly. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just not doing enough." Jason studied her for a moment, not critically, but thoughtfully. "That's not what I see," he said. She glanced at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "I see two kids who are respectful, engaged, and genuinely kind," he continued. "That doesn't happen by accident." Her lips parted slightly, as if she expected him to soften the statement. He didn't. "You're doing something right," he added. She looked down at her hands. "Thank you," she said quietly, and this time the gratitude felt honest, unperformed. Jason leaned back, resting his forearms on his thighs. "Look, I'm just your parents' neighbor," he said, his tone easing into something more conversational. "I don't know everything that's going on, but I'm a pretty good listener." She tilted her head, studying him now, measuring. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded once. "Yeah." There was another pause, longer this time, but not empty. It felt like a decision forming. When she spoke again, the words came more fluidly. She talked about the divorce first, briefly, without bitterness but with undeniable weight. She talked about trying to keep things stable for her kids while figuring out how to rebuild. About the limited job options in a small community where everyone knew everyone else's situation before you even finished explaining it yourself. Jason didn't interject, didn't offer quick fixes or reassuring cliches. He listened to understand, not to solve. By the time she finished, the heaviness in her voice had softened just a fraction. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, almost embarrassed. "I don't usually just unload like that." He smiled faintly. Don't worry about it. Then his expression shifted slightly, something thoughtful taking hold as he looked past her, toward the tree line. I might have an idea, he said. She straightened a little. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, Jason stood up and walked toward the edge of the yard. He crouched down near the pine needles, scooping up a handful along with a few scattered cones. When he returned, he set them on the picnic table with quiet deliberation. Susan raised an eyebrow. What are you doing? He grinned, bright, boyish, and unexpectedly infectious. Art class. She blinked. I'm sorry. Go grab your kids, he said, already turning back toward his house. I'll be right back. She hesitated, watching him jog off with a kind of baffled curiosity. Then she looked at the pine cones, then back toward the house. For a moment, she stood there, caught between skepticism and something she hadn't felt strongly in a while. Curiosity won. By the time Jason returned, arms full of a cardboard box packed with various odds and ends, Susan was seated at the picnic table with her children. Her daughter perked up immediately upon seeing him. Mr. Cornell, she exclaimed, practically bouncing. What are we doing? Making magic, he said simply, setting the box down. Her younger brother clapped. Magic is my favorite thing. Then you're going to love this, Jason replied. Susan crossed her arms loosely, a small, amused smile tugging at her lips. All right, she said. I'm officially intrigued. Explain. Jason glanced at her, then back at the materials on the table. Do you like knowing the ending of a story before it starts? He asked. She frowned slightly. No, I like seeing how things unfold. He nodded, clearly pleased. Good. Then we're going to build something the same way. She looked at him, still uncertain, but no longer doubtful. He gestured toward the supplies. Let's begin. Chapter 2. The shape of something new. If Jason Cornell had learned anything from years of teaching, it was that curiosity didn't need to be forced. It only needed the right invitation. All right, he said, rolling up his sleeves as he opened the box. Rule number 1. There are no mistakes here, just experiments that haven't figured themselves out yet. Susan's son raised his hand immediately, grin wide. What if I mess it up on purpose? Jason didn't miss a beat. Then you're officially an artist. The boy pumped his fist like he'd just been handed a medal. Susan leaned back slightly, watching as Jason began laying out the contents of the box. A worn mortar and pestle, containers of cornstarch and baking soda, a jug of school glue, measuring spoons, and a small stack of wax paper sheets. You just keep all this on hand? She asked, half amused. For emergencies, he said lightly. She arched an eyebrow. This qualifies as an emergency? Jason glanced at her, his expression softening just slightly. Sometimes you don't need sirens to know something could use fixing. For a brief moment, their eyes met again, less accidental this time, more aware. Susan looked away first, clearing her throat as she shifted her attention back to the table. Her daughter, already leaning forward with interest, tapped the pine cones. So what do we do first, Mr. Cornell? First, he said, clapping his hands once. We break things. The children lit up. Under his guidance, they began snapping apart the pine cones, pulling them piece by piece into smaller fragments. The sound was oddly satisfying, tiny cracks and splinters marking progress. Not too big, Jason instructed gently. Think breadcrumbs. The boy held up a chunk. Like this. Jason examined it thoughtfully. That's more like a crouton. We're aiming for something smaller. Susan laughed quietly to herself, the first genuine, unguarded laugh Jason had heard from her. It caught him off guard for a second, and if he lingered on it internally, it didn't show outwardly. Once the table was scattered with broken pieces, Jason demonstrated how to use the mortar and pestle. You're going to grind it down, he said, placing a portion of pine cone into the bowl. Slow and steady. Let the tool do the work. Her daughter immediately took over that station, concentrating fiercely as she pressed and twisted. Her younger brother attempted the same with pine needles, though his version involved dramatic effort and enthusiastic sound effects. Jason glanced at Susan. He's committed. That's one word for it, she said, smiling. And you? He asked, nodding toward an empty spot on the table. You in? Or just supervising? I don't think I've ever supervised anything successfully, she admitted, reaching for some pine needles. Might as well join. Good choice, he said. For the next half hour, the four of them worked together. The rhythm of it settled into something easy. Pass the materials, sift the powder, compare textures. The children chattered constantly, their excitement feeding off Jason's calm enthusiasm. At one point, the boy sniffed his hands and declared, I smell like a forest wizard. Jason leaned in thoughtfully. That's an advanced level. Most people start as apprentices. I skipped that part, the boy said seriously. Clearly, Jason replied. Susan watched the exchange, her focus drifting between her children and Jason. He didn't dominate the space, didn't try to impress or command. He guided, suggested, invited. It was subtle, but she noticed it. When the materials had been finely ground and sifted into neat piles of fragrant powder, Jason moved to the next step. Now we make the base, he said, pouring small amounts into a mixing bowl. A little water at a time. We want it to stick, but not fall apart. He demonstrated, kneading the mixture until it formed a pliable, clay-like consistency. Who wants to try? He asked. Both kids raised their hands immediately. Take turns, Susan said automatically. Jason nodded approvingly. Excellent rule. They worked the mixture together, occasionally making it too wet or too dry, adjusting with Jason's gentle direction. When they finally got it right, he pinched off a piece and rolled it between his palms, shaping it into a small cone. Like this, he said, setting it down. Uniform size helps it burn evenly. Susan tilted her head. Burn? Incense, he said simply. Natural, pine-scented. Completely handmade. She looked at the small cone, then at the remaining mixture. You're serious? Very. Her daughter leaned closer, eyes wide. We made that. Jason smiled. You did. Something shifted in Susan's expression. Not quite realization yet, but the beginning of it. They shaped the rest carefully, lining them up on wax paper. Each cone slightly imperfect, each one uniquely theirs. When they finished, Jason wiped his hands and reached for the other ingredients. Now for the second part, he said. Base plates. He explained how to mix the cornstarch, baking soda, and glue into a smooth, white clay. The kids reacted with equal parts fascination and delight as the mixture transformed under their hands. This is like, edible? The boy asked. No, Susan and Jason said simultaneously. They exchanged a brief look, one of shared amusement, and then quickly looked away again. Definitely not edible, Jason added. They rolled out small discs, shaping shallow indentations in the center to hold the incense cones once they dried. By the time they finished, the table was filled with their creations. Rows of pine cones and simple white trays, each one carrying the unmistakable mark of effort. Susan leaned back, hands resting on her thighs. Okay, she said slowly. I'll admit it. That was fun. Jason grinned. Told you. But, she continued, glancing at the display, I still don't see how this connects to anything other than a really good afternoon. That's because, he said, brushing his hands together. You're trying to skip to the last chapter. She narrowed her eyes at him. You're enjoying this. A little, he admitted. Her daughter piped up. What happens tomorrow? Jason pointed at the projects. Tomorrow we finish them. And then, he looked at Susan, not the children. And then, he said, we figure out what they're worth. The word hung there. Worth. Susan felt it land differently than the rest of the conversation. He wasn't just talking about crafts. Or maybe he was. But not only that. She studied him, this time more openly. You're saying, she began slowly, this could be something we sell? Jason shrugged lightly, as if it were an obvious step. People love handmade things, especially when they come with a story. She stared at the table again, seeing it differently now. Not just an activity, possibility. But I don't know anything about selling things, she said, the familiar edge of doubt creeping back. You don't need to know everything, Jason replied calmly. You just need to start. She looked at him again, searching his face for hesitation. There wasn't any. Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. It wasn't suspicion. It was honesty. Jason took a moment before answering. Because you didn't ask, he said. And you probably should have felt like you could. She absorbed that, her throat tightening slightly as she looked away. The kids began gathering their things, already talking about what shapes they'd try next time. Their excitement filled the space Jason chose not to. Finally, Susan stood. Tomorrow, she said, almost to herself. Jason nodded. Tomorrow. He turned to leave, walking back toward his house with the same easy stride he'd come with. Susan watched him go, her arms folding loosely across herself. Hope stirred in her chest, tentative, fragile, but they're all the same. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't push it away. Chapter 3. Drying time. Sunday arrived slower than Susan expected. She noticed it almost immediately, the way time stretched when you were waiting for something you didn't fully understand yet. It had been a long time since she'd looked forward to anything with more curiosity than worry, and the unfamiliar feeling followed her from the moment she woke up. The house was already awake. Her son was laughing in the living room at something animated and loud, while her daughter sat at the kitchen table, carefully poking one of the dried incense cones they'd made the day before. Don't break it, Susan said, pouring coffee into her favorite chipped mug. I'm not, her daughter replied quickly. I'm testing it. Testing it for what? To see if it feels like a real one. Susan smiled faintly. And, her daughter lifted it carefully between her fingers. It does. That simple certainty. So absolute, so proud, tightened something warm in Susan's chest. They made that. Not bought. Not borrowed. Not barely managed. Made. A knock at the back door interrupted her thoughts. Her son jumped up. That's him. Susan blinked. You don't know. But the boy was already halfway to the door, flinging it open with enthusiasm that didn't seem to recognize hesitation as a valid response to anything. Jason stood there, holding a small paper bag in one hand and what looked like a lighter in the other. Good morning, he said, stepping inside only after Susan gave a small nod of welcome. "Mr. Cornell," her daughter greeted, already standing. "We finished them." "Did you?" he said, eyebrows lifting with interest. "Let me see." They gathered at the table, the four of them forming an easy circle that felt less arranged and more natural than the day before. Jason picked up one of the cones, turning it between his fingers with careful attention. "Nicely done," he said. "You kept the structure solid." His tone wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't the kind of praise given to children out of obligation. It was real. His daughter beamed. "All right," Jason continued, reaching into the paper bag and pulling out a small metal tray. "Today we test." Her son leaned forward. "We get to light it?" "We get to observe it," Jason corrected gently. "Same thing," the boy said. "Close enough," Jason conceded. He set one of the cones on the tray and struck the lighter, the small flame flickering to life. Carefully, he touched it to the tip of the incense cone. The flame caught briefly before shrinking into a slow ember, releasing a thin ribbon of smoke that curled into the air. All four of them watched. The scent followed a moment later, not overwhelming, but present. Earthy, clean, familiar in a way that felt grounding. "Whoa," the boy whispered. "It smells like outside," the girl added. Jason nodded. "That's the idea." Susan didn't speak at first. She just watched the smoke spiral upward, her arms folding loosely as something inside her shifted into focus. It worked. Not sort of. Not almost. It worked. Her eyes flicked to Jason, who was already observing their reactions rather than the incense itself. "What now?" she asked quietly. Jason leaned back slightly, as if giving space for the answer to land properly. "Now," he said, "we figure out how to make more." Her first instinct was hesitation. It rose automatically, practiced and familiar. "How much is more?" she asked. "As much as you're comfortable with," he replied. "That's not really an answer." "No," he admitted. "It's not supposed to be." Susan exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "I don't even know where to start. We made, what, 15 cones? 17, her daughter corrected proudly. Jason smiled. "Quality control." Susan shook her head faintly. "Okay, 17. That's not exactly a business." "It's a beginning," Jason said. She looked at him, studying him more closely this time. There was no pressure in his tone. No urgency. Just quiet certainty. "You think someone would actually buy these?" she asked. "I know someone who would," he said. Her brows lifted slightly. "Who?" "My aunt," he replied. "She runs a small shop in town. Local crafts, handmade goods, things with a story behind them." Susan's posture shifted, something in her attention sharpening. "And you think she'd be interested in this?" Jason gestured toward the slowly burning cone. "I think she'd be interested in seeing it." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said again, unbothered. "But it's the step before the next one." She considered that. Across the yard, through the open window, Carl's voice drifted faintly from inside the house. "Is that pine?" he called. Susan turned and raised her voice slightly. "It is." There was a brief silence before Carl responded. "Smells like you finally did something useful back there." Jason laughed under his breath. "He's recovering well." Susan rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "You get used to it." From the doorway, her mother Margaret appeared, hands resting on her hips as she took in the scene. The table, the materials, Jason standing comfortably among them. "Well," she said, glancing from Susan to the children. "Looks like I missed something important." "You did," her granddaughter said immediately. "We're making incense." Margaret stepped closer, leaning just enough to catch the scent. Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh," that one syllable carried weight. Jason inclined his head slightly. "We're testing a few ideas." Margaret looked at Susan now, not Jason. "And?" she asked. Susan hesitated, but only for a moment. "And it works," she said. Margaret nodded slowly, something knowing passing through her expression. "Well, that's a start, isn't it?" Jason picked up one of the small white trays they'd made. "We'll need consistency," he said, shifting gently back into guidance. "Same size, same mix, and we can start experimenting, different scents eventually." "Different?" the boy echoed. "Like what?" Jason glanced toward the greenhouse. "What do you grow in there?" Margaret followed his gaze, a small spark lighting in her eyes. "Herbs, flowers, whatever decides to cooperate with me that season." Jason smiled. "That's a lot of possibilities." Susan looked between them, the pieces connecting more clearly now. "You're saying," she began slowly, "we could make different kinds?" "That's usually how these things grow," Jason said. Margaret stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on the back of Susan's chair. "The greenhouse gets more sun than it knows what to do with," she said. "I've been meaning to put it to better use." Susan glanced up at her mother. "You'd let us use it?" Margaret lifted one shoulder. "Better than letting it sit there while your father critiques the wind." "Hey!" Carl called from inside. "The wind deserves critique." Jason chuckled again, shaking his head slightly. Susan looked back at the table. The cones, the trays, the quiet proof of something that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. You really think this could work? She asked Jason again, softer this time. He met her gaze without hesitation. I think you can make it work, he said. There it was again, that subtle distinction. Not saved. Not handed. Built. She exhaled slowly, then straightened in her seat. All right, she said. What do we need to do first? Jason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached over, pinched off a small piece of unused mixture they'd prepared, and rolled it between his hands into another perfect shape. Same step as yesterday, he said finally, setting it down alongside the others. We repeat. Her daughter clapped. I like this plan. Her son nodded vigorously. Me too. Margaret smiled faintly, watching all of them with quiet satisfaction. Susan looked at Jason one more time. Okay, she said again, this time with more certainty. Let's repeat. Jason nodded. And just like that, something small but real began to take shape. Chapter 4. First Sale Nerves. By midweek, repetition had turned into rhythm. What began as a single experiment on a quiet Saturday had grown into a steady routine that filled the afternoons behind the Jameson house with purpose. The picnic table had become their workshop, the forest their supplier, and the greenhouse, under Margaret's careful supervision, the start of something larger. Susan hadn't realized how quickly momentum could build when it wasn't weighed down by doubt. It still lingered, of course, creeping in around the edges when she paused too long. But Jason had a way of keeping things moving without ever pushing. Same size, he reminded gently as her son proudly presented a wildly uneven cone. It is the same size, the boy argued. Jason tilted his head. If we measure by enthusiasm, absolutely. Susan laughed, smoothing out one of her own pieces. He gets that from his grandfather. Hey! Carl called from his chair position just inside the back door, legs stretched out and elevated like a general refusing to leave the battlefield. Precision is overrated. Jason didn't look up. That explains the greenhouse roof situation. Margaret snorted from inside. Carl grumbled something indignant, but his smile gave him away. The atmosphere had shifted in the days since that first afternoon. It wasn't just lighter, it was alive. The table filled faster now. Their movements grew more confident. Even Susan, who had approached the whole idea cautiously, found herself working without second-guessing every step. Jason noticed, though he didn't comment on it directly. Instead, he packed the finished cones carefully into a small wooden box he'd brought that day. What's that for? Susan asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Field trip, he said. She blinked. What? My aunt's shop, he clarified. She's open this afternoon. Susan's stomach tightened instantly. Oh, she said. You meant, like now? Jason looked at her. Unless you'd rather wait. The offer was genuine. No expectation hidden behind it. Susan looked at the box, then at the rows of cones laid out to dry, then at her children, both watching her with barely contained excitement. Her daughter spoke first. Mom, we should go. Her son nodded emphatically. Yeah, what if we're rich? Susan huffed a quiet laugh. That's not exactly how this works. Jason leaned against the table. He's thinking big. I respect it. She crossed her arms loosely, looking back at Jason. What if she doesn't like them? Then she doesn't like them, he said simply. That's it. That's it. Susan frowned slightly. You're very calm about this. He shrugged. It's not the last opportunity in the world. No pressure. No stakes exaggerated beyond reality. That helped more than anything. She exhaled slowly, then nodded once. Okay. Her kids cheered like they'd just been handed a victory. The drive into town was quiet in a way that didn't feel strained. Jason drove, one hand resting loosely on the wheel, the other tapping lightly against the box on the seat beside him as if keeping time with something only he could hear. Susan sat in the passenger seat, watching the familiar road pass by with a strange sense of unfamiliarity. The same fences, the same open fields, but everything felt slightly different when you were carrying intention with you. You're thinking too hard, Jason said without looking at her. She turned toward him. Excuse me? I can hear it, he added calmly. You can hear me thinking? Loudly. She narrowed her eyes. That's not a thing. It is when someone's planning 3 different worst-case scenarios at once. Susan opened her mouth to argue, then paused. Okay, maybe I am, she admitted. Jason nodded as if this confirmed something obvious. Want to share one? What if she thinks it's amateur? Then it is, he said. She frowned. You're not helping. I am, he replied easily. You're just deciding it's not enough. Susan stared at him for a beat, then shook her head. You're impossible. And yet, he said lightly, turning onto the main road into town. We're still going. She looked out the window again. But this time, there was the faintest hint of a smile. The shop wasn't large, but it carried presence. Handcrafted signs hung slightly unevenly along the walls. Shelves displayed pottery, woven goods, carved wood pieces, and small batches of homemade candles. Everything felt intentional, even in its imperfections. Jason picked up the box as they stepped inside. Stay relaxed, he murmured. That's easy for you to say, Susan muttered back. From behind the counter, a woman in her late 50s looked up, her expression brightening immediately when she saw Jason. Well, if it isn't my favorite nephew who only visits when he wants something, she called. Jason grinned. That's not true. Sometimes I visit before I want something. She laughed, stepping around the counter to greet him with a quick hug. Then her eyes shifted to Susan. And who have you brought with you? She asked, curiosity gentle but unmistakable. Jason stepped aside slightly. This is Susan. Susan offered a small, polite smile. Hi. Hi. The woman replied warmly. I'm Lila. Jason set the box on the counter. We've been working on something, he said. Thought you might take a look. Lila's brows lifted. We. Susan swallowed slightly as Lila opened the box. Inside, the neatly arranged cones sat with quiet confidence. Lila didn't speak immediately. She picked one up, turning it between her fingers the way Jason had days earlier. This is homemade, she said. Yes, Jason answered. She reached for a lighter on the counter, lighting the tip of one cone just enough to test it. The same thin ribbon of smoke curled upward, carrying that familiar pine scent with it. Lila inhaled, her expression shifting. Not dramatically, but enough. Well, she said after a moment. This is interesting. Susan's chest tightened. Interesting good? She asked carefully. Lila looked at her directly now. Interesting promising, she corrected. It wasn't overwhelming praise, but it wasn't dismissal either. Susan felt herself exhale without realizing she'd been holding her breath. Lila set the cone down. Where are you sourcing your material? Susan blinked. The backyard. Lila smiled faintly. Even better. She looked at Jason. This was your idea. Jason shook his head slightly. Not really. Lila's eyes flicked back to Susan again, studying her. How many can you make in a week? She asked. Susan hesitated, but only briefly this time. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I can find out. Lila nodded once, satisfied with the answer. Bring me a consistent batch, she said. Same quality, same size. We'll start small. See how they move. Susan's pulse jumped. You mean, you'll sell them? I mean, Lila said calmly. I'll give them shelf space. What happens after that is up to you. There it was again. Opportunity, not guarantee. Susan nodded slowly. Okay. Jason remained silent, leaning casually against the counter, letting the moment belong entirely to her. Lila smiled faintly. Good. I like people who don't overpromise. As they left the shop, the bell above the door chimed softly behind them. Susan stepped onto the sidewalk and just stood there for a second. That actually happened, she said. Jason adjusted his grip on the now lighter box. It did. She turned toward him, searching his face. You knew she'd say yes. I knew she'd consider it, he corrected. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. But it's the part you needed. Susan looked down at her hands, then back up at him. This still doesn't feel real. Jason smiled faintly. That's because it just started. For once, the uncertainty didn't scare her. Felt like motion. And she wasn't standing still anymore. Chapter 5. Shelf space and sunlight momentum Susan realized had weight to it. Not heavy in the suffocating way she was used to, but present. Tangible. It settled into her mornings and followed her into the afternoons, shaping her days whether she meant for it to or not. There were measurements now. Counts. Drying times. Small decisions that felt significant simply because they were hers to make. Not that one, she said, reaching across the table to gently nudge her son's latest creation aside. Too soft. It looks the same, he protested. Looks, she said, handing it back to him, is not the same as ready. Jason, standing to the side with his usual quiet posture of involvement, nodded slightly. Your mom's right. Give it a little more time. The boy sighed dramatically but complied, setting it down more carefully this time. Susan didn't miss the exchange. The way Jason backed her up without inserting himself as the authority. It wasn't showy, but it mattered. It reinforced something she was still getting used to. She was leading this, even if she didn't always feel like it yet. Across the yard, Margaret stepped out of the greenhouse with a small basket cradled against her hip. The scent of fresh-cut herbs drifted ahead of her. I've got lavender starting to bloom properly, she announced. Jason's head tilted slightly, interest immediate. That'll mix well. Susan wiped her hands again, stepping closer to inspect the small purple sprigs. You think so? I know so, Jason said simply. Different base scent, same process. You'll just adjust the ratio a little. Susan glanced at him. You're saying that like I know what that means. You will, he replied. There it was again, that quiet, unshakable confidence. Not in himself, but in her ability to figure things out. She took a breath and nodded. Okay, we try it. Margaret smiled softly, handing over the basket. I'll keep them coming. Inside the house, Carl yelled, Don't overharvest, woman. That plant's got rights. Margaret didn't even turn. The plant's doing more work than you are. Jason hid a grin. By Friday, they had their first counted batch. 42 cones. Uniform enough to meet Lila's standard. Not perfect, but consistent. Intentional. Susan lined them carefully into the wooden box Jason had brought back from the shop earlier that week. Her hands were steadier now. The hesitation that once lingered in every movement had thinned into something closer to focus. "You're quiet," Jason noted from the doorway. "I'm thinking," she said. "Dangerous." She glanced over her shoulder at him, a faint smile breaking through. "You say that like I haven't been doing it all week." "You've been doing," he corrected. "Thinking is what slows you down." She turned back to the box. "What if this doesn't sell?" Jason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped further into the room, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What happens if it doesn't?" he asked. She paused, considering. "We make better ones?" she said finally. He nodded. "That's usually how it goes." Susan let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "You make everything sound simple." "It is simple," he said. "Not easy, just simple." She closed the box carefully, resting her hands on top of it for a moment. "I'm coming with you this time," she said. Jason's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't question it. Good. Lila's shop felt different the second time. Less intimidating. More real. Susan carried the box herself this time, her grip firm but not tense. Jason walked beside her, hands free. His role shifted without needing to be announced. This was her step. The bell chimed as they entered. Lila looked up from arranging a display, her expression already curious. "That was quicker than I expected." Susan stepped forward, setting the box on the counter. "We worked all week." Lila smiled faintly at that choice of words. "Let's have a look." She opened the box and examined the contents with methodical attention. One by one, she picked up the cones, checking shape, density, consistency. Then she lit one just as she had before. The smoke rose, steady and clean. The scent followed, pine yes but softer now. Balanced. Lila inhaled, this time with a more deliberate pause. "You adjusted something," she said. Susan straightened slightly. "We tightened the mix. Better binding." Jason didn't say a word. Lila's gaze flicked briefly toward him, then back to Susan. "Good," she said. She closed the box and nodded once. "I'll take these." The words landed quietly, but they landed. Susan blinked. "You will." "I will," Lila confirmed. "We'll start small. See how they move this week." Susan's heart kicked in her chest. "And if they move?" Lila smiled just slightly. "Then we talk about your next batch." Susan nodded slowly, absorbing the moment. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "Nothing for now," Lila replied. "I'll handle the display. You focus on making the next set better than this one." Susan let out a quiet laugh. "I can do that." Jason finally spoke, his tone easy. "Told you." She shot him a look, but it wasn't annoyed. It was grateful. They didn't leave right away. Susan lingered near the shelves, her eyes drifting over the other items for sale. Handmade pottery, carved wooden figurines, bundles of dried herbs wrapped neatly with twine. It all looked possible now. Jason stepped up beside her, following her gaze. "You're already thinking ahead," he said. "Maybe," she admitted. He nodded toward a display of small ceramic dishes. "Holders." Susan's head tilted. "Better ones." "Exactly." She crossed her arms, considering. "I might need help with that part." Jason shrugged lightly. "You know someone who specializes in art." She gave him a sidelong look. "You volunteering?" "I'm suggesting," he said. "Big difference." She smiled, the expression lingering longer this time. "I like your suggestions," she said quietly. He met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them, something that had nothing to do with incense or sales or process, something warmer. He broke it first, just slightly. "Good. I've got more." "Of course you do," she said, though there was no annoyance in it now, only ease. Back at the house, Margaret met them by the table. "Well?" she asked. Susan didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the empty box down and looked at her mother, then toward the greenhouse, then at her kids playing near the tree line. Then she smiled. "She took them," she said. Margaret's face softened with quiet pride. "Of course she did." From inside, Carl called. "Told you it'd work." "No, you didn't," Margaret shot back. "I was thinking it," he insisted. Jason chuckled under his breath as he stepped back toward his own yard. Susan watched him go this time. Not with uncertainty, not with hesitation, with clarity. Because somewhere between pine needles and quiet encouragement, something had shifted. She wasn't waiting for things to fall apart anymore. She was building something, and for the first time she wasn't doing it alone. Chapter 6. The space between signals. Susan hadn't expected waiting to feel this different. Before, waiting had always meant uncertainty pressed into stillness, wondering if something would fall apart, or worse, stay exactly as it was. But this was movement disguised as patience. It settled into her days in an unfamiliar way. Not heavy, not hollow, just present. 3 days after Lila had taken the first batch, Susan found herself standing in the greenhouse, lightly brushing her fingers along the lavender Margaret had set aside for drying. The scent clung to her skin. Clean, steady, grounding. She was getting used to that. "You're pacing," Margaret said from the doorway, arms folded loosely as she watched her daughter circle the same patch of sunlight for the third time. "I'm not pacing," Susan replied automatically. Margaret lifted an eyebrow. "You've checked those plants like they owe you money." Susan exhaled, stopping. "I just don't know what to expect." "That's the part you don't control," Margaret said. Susan turned toward her. "You're very calm about this." Margaret smiled faintly. "I've learned the difference between worrying and working. You're doing the second one." Susan nodded slowly, absorbing that. It wasn't reassurance exactly, but it steadied her more than empty comfort would have. From outside, her son's voice carried in, loud and bright. "Mom, we made more." "Define we," she called back. "Mr. Cornell says it counts if I supervise." Susan closed her eyes briefly, a small laugh breaking through. "Sounds accurate," Margaret murmured. Something warm flickered in Susan's chest as she stepped out of the greenhouse and into the yard. Jason stood at the table with her daughter, both of them focused on a new batch of cones. He was demonstrating something, his hands moving slowly, deliberately, making sure she could see each step before trying it herself. "You're pressing too hard," he said gently. "I'm not," her daughter insisted. Jason smiled slightly. "You are. But that's how you learn it." The girl adjusted her grip, trying again. "Better this time." "There you go," he said. Susan leaned against the porch railing, watching the exchange. It wasn't just that he showed up, it was how he showed up. No announcement, no expectation. Just presence. Consistent and steady in a way that didn't demand attention but earned it anyway. He glanced up and caught her watching. "Timing's good," he said. "We were about to make a mess without supervision." "I resent that," her daughter said without looking up. "You'll grow into it," Jason replied. Susan walked over, crossing her arms loosely. "Any word from your aunt?" she asked. Jason shook his head. "Not yet." She tried to hide her reaction, but he saw it anyway. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Filling in silence with worst-case scenarios." She frowned slightly. "It's not worst case. It's realistic." Jason tilted his head. "Realistic doesn't mean negative." Susan opened her mouth, then stopped. "Okay, fair," she admitted. Her daughter looked between them. "Are we in trouble?" "No," both of them said at the same time. The girl nodded once, satisfied, and went back to work. Jason leaned back lightly against the table, his posture relaxed. "You made something good," he said calmly. "That doesn't stop being true just because you don't have results yet." Susan studied him. "Do you ever doubt anything?" "Of course," he said. When it matters," he replied. "Just not before it happens." She let out a quiet breath, something in her shoulders easing. "All right," she said. They fell into a comfortable rhythm after that. Mixing, shaping, adjusting. The afternoon slipped by without feeling like it needed to be filled. Just lived. It was late enough that the sunlight had shifted by the time Jason finally wiped his hands clean and stepped back. "Check your consistency," he said, nodding toward the finished row. Susan did, running her fingers lightly over the surface of one cone, then another. "Better," she said. "Better," he echoed. Her son leaned back in his chair. "Can we light one?" "Not these," Susan said. Therefore, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut her off. All four of them turned. Lila stepped out of the vehicle, closing the door with an easy familiarity as she approached the yard. "Well," she called. "I figured I'd save you the suspense." Susan's heart jumped so sharply it almost made her laugh. Jason didn't move. He didn't step forward. He didn't say anything. He just stayed exactly where he was, letting her take this. Susan wiped her hands quickly on her jeans as she stepped forward. "Hi," she said, trying not to sound as on edge as she felt. "Hi," Lila replied easily. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Susan said. Lila's eyes drifted to the table, taking in the fresh batch, the materials, the setup that had clearly grown beyond a one-time activity. "You didn't wait," Lila noted. Susan shook her head. "No. Good." The word was simple, but it landed solidly. Lila stepped closer, picking up one of the newly finished cones. She turned it slowly, then set it back down. "They sold," she said, just like that. No build-up, no ceremony. Susan blinked. All of them, Lila confirmed. "Faster than I expected." The world didn't stop, but it felt like something inside Susan did for just a second. "People asked if we had more," Lila continued. "I told them we would." Susan's breath came out uneven, almost laughing, but not quite. "You mean?" she started. "I mean," Lila said, meeting her eyes steadily. "You're not testing anymore." There it was. Not possibility. Reality. Susan glanced back at the table, the new batch still drying, still imperfect. "We're not ready for large scale," she said carefully. Lila smiled slightly. "Neither is anyone when they start." Jason's reflection flickered briefly in the corner of Susan's vision. Still quiet, still steady. She turned back to Lila. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Lila didn't hesitate. Consistency. Packaging, eventually. Maybe a name. Susan blinked again. A name. People remember names, Lila said. Stories, too. Susan's mind raced for half a second, then slowed, settling. A name. Something of her own. She inhaled slowly, then nodded. "Okay," she said. Lila stepped back, clearly satisfied. "Bring me your next batch when it's ready." Then she turned, heading back toward her car without lingering. No fuss, no pressure, just expectation. The yard felt quieter after she left, but not empty. Different. Susan turned slowly, looking at Jason. He raised his brows slightly. "Well," she smiled, wide this time, unguarded and real. "They sold," she said. "They did," he agreed. "They actually sold." "You made something people wanted," he replied. There it was again. Not luck, not chance. Work. She stepped closer, not quite aware of it happening. "This wasn't just your idea," she said. Jason shook his head lightly. "It was a suggestion. You showed up every day," she said. "You did the work every day," he countered. They stood there, closer now than either of them had been before, the air between them carrying something new, something unspoken. "So what now?" she asked softly. Jason's smile was easy, but there was something deeper behind it now. "Now," he said, "you decide how big you want this to be." Susan held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. And for the first time, the question didn't scare her. It excited her. Chapter 7. Saying it out loud, the name took longer than Susan expected. It wasn't for lack of ideas. Those came quickly, scribbled on scrap paper and the back of grocery receipts, whispered out loud only to be dismissed just as fast. Some sounded too grand. Others felt too small. A few didn't feel like anything at all. Jason didn't offer suggestions right away. Instead, he sat at the edge of the picnic table one evening, watching her as she worked through another batch, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said lightly. Susan didn't look up. "It's a name. It matters." "It does," he agreed. "But it doesn't need to carry everything at once." She finally glanced over at him. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one putting your name on it." He tilted his head. "You don't have to use your name. That's not the point." "Then what is?" She hesitated, fingers stilling on the mixture in front of her. "It has to feel like something I built," she said. "Not something I fell into." Jason nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she'd said out loud. "You already built it," he replied. "The name just catches up later." Susan looked at him for a long moment. "You really believe that?" she said. "I do." No hesitation, no second guessing. She exhaled, leaning back slightly. "You're annoyingly steady." "I get that a lot," he said. She smiled faintly, then looked down at the row of finished cones. "Pine and light," she said quietly. Jason blinked. "Say that again." "Pine and light," she repeated, a little stronger. "It's simple, honest. That's what it feels like." Jason nodded once. "That works. You didn't even critique it. It doesn't need it." That settled something. She picked up her phone and typed it out, staring at the words for a second before locking the screen again. "Pine and light," she said one more time. This time it felt real. The next step came faster than the first. Lila didn't hesitate when Susan brought in the newly bundled batch, this time with simple label tags tied around each set. "Pine and light." "You're learning quickly," Lila said, examining the presentation. Susan nodded. "I'm trying." "Don't try," Lila replied calmly. "Do. You've been doing just fine." Jason stayed near the back of the shop while they spoke, hands tucked loosely in his pockets. His role reduced again to quiet presence. Lila noticed but didn't comment on it. Instead, she turned her attention fully to Susan. "You'll want to think about scale," she said. "If demand grows, you need a way to keep up without burning yourself out." Susan exhaled softly. "I've been thinking about that." "Good," Lila said. "Because it will grow." No flourish, just certainty. Susan felt it settle into her chest. Not heavy, not overwhelming. Anchoring. That night, long after her children had gone to bed and the house had quieted into a gentle stillness, Susan sat on the back steps with her notebook open in her lap. Numbers, materials, time. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was planning. The screen door creaked softly behind her. "You're still working," Jason said, stepping out onto the porch. She didn't turn right away. "Just organizing things." He moved down the steps, stopping just off to her side. "You've been organizing things all day." "That's because there are a lot of things now," she said. He nodded slightly. "That tends to happen." She closed the notebook and set it beside her. "I talked to your aunt today," she said. "I figured. She thinks this could grow faster than I'm expecting." Jason glanced out toward the tree line. "She's probably right." Susan studied him, the quiet space between them stretching. Not uncomfortable, but charged with something unfinished. I need to do this properly, she said. Business registration. Maybe an online shop. Structure. Jason smiled faintly. You're already thinking like an owner. I am an owner, she corrected gently. He nodded once. Yes, you are. There was a pause. Then she said it. What about you? Jason looked at her. What about me? You've been part of this from the start, she said. You show up every day. You help more than you admit. That doesn't make it mine, he replied. It makes you part of it, she insisted. Jason considered her carefully, weighing his words. This needs to be yours, he said finally. Something you built. Something no one can take from you. I'm not asking you to take it, she said. Then what are you asking? She stood up slowly, closing the small space between them before she lost her nerve. I'm asking you to stand with me, she said. Her voice didn't shake. Her gaze didn't falter. I don't need to prove that I can do this anymore, she continued. I already did that. I need to choose who I build with. The air shifted. Jason held her eyes, something deeper rising behind his usual calm. You're sure? He asked quietly. I've been sure, she said. I just didn't know if you were. For once, his answer didn't come slowly. He stepped closer, just enough to erase the last bit of distance between them, and kissed her before the moment could be overthought. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't rushed. It was certain. Susan didn't pull back, didn't question it, didn't need to. When they finally separated, she laughed softly under her breath. That was not how that speech was supposed to end, she said. Jason tilted his head slightly. You were taking too long. She smiled, shaking her head. I had a whole thing planned. I believe you, he said. She looked at him, really looked this time. Not as her parents' neighbor, not as the steady presence at her side. As someone she had chosen. So, she said, her voice quieter now but no less certain. Where does that leave us? Jason didn't hesitate. I'm all in, he said. No qualifiers. No conditions. Just truth. Susan exhaled, something inside her finally settling into place. Good, she said. He smiled faintly. Good. The quiet of the night wrapped around them, no longer empty, full. And for the first time in a long time, nothing about it felt uncertain. Chapter 8. Building forward, the morning after certainty looked surprisingly ordinary. Sunlight crept across the kitchen floor in soft, familiar lines. Coffee brewed the same way it always had. The world outside carried on with its steady rhythm, unchanged and yet somehow different. Susan noticed it immediately, not in the space around her but in how she moved through it. There was no hesitation when she reached for her notebook. No second-guessing when she flipped to the pages filled with numbers, ideas, and plans. The words pine and light sat at the top of one page in her own handwriting. No longer tentative, no longer just an idea. Felt claimed. You're smiling at paper, her son said, wandering into the kitchen. She glanced up. It's good paper. That's weird paper, he replied. Breakfast first, she said, tapping the counter. He shrugged and obeyed, already distracted by something else. She watched him for a moment, then looked down again. Everything she was building, every decision, every step, it was for this, for them, for stability that didn't feel fragile. A knock sounded at the back door. She didn't even need to check. Come in, she called. Jason pushed the door open, stepping inside with the same easy familiarity that had grown naturally over the past weeks. But there was something quieter in his posture this morning, something aware. Morning, he said. Morning, she replied. For a brief moment, neither of them moved beyond that. Then her son looked up and grinned. Are you staying for breakfast? Jason glanced at Susan. She smiled. You can stay for breakfast. That was enough. Then I'm staying, he said, stepping further in. Later that morning, they gathered in the backyard again. Not in the same way as before. Before, the table had been a place of discovery. Messy, uncertain, trying things out. Now it felt organized, purposeful. There were measured ingredients, labeled containers, bundles of lavender drying in the shade. A small notebook sat open beside Susan, listing quantities and timing with neat precision. Jason leaned against the edge of the table, watching her work. You've upgraded, he noted. I told you, she said, glancing up briefly. I'm doing this properly. He nodded. You are. She paused, then added, I've been thinking about what you said. That could mean a lot of things, he replied. About scaling, she clarified. About structure. Jason tilted his head slightly. Go on. I need to make this official, she said. Form an LLC. Separate finances. Do it right from the start. He smiled faintly. That's a good call. I know, she said. And, she hesitated, then continued, I want to set up an online shop, not just rely on local sales. Jason's brows lifted, clearly approving. That's the next step. She nodded. I don't want to be limited by geography if this keeps growing. It won't, he said simply. Not the way you're doing it. Susan studied him for a moment. You always sound so certain, she said. I am. he replied. She shook her head faintly, but she was smiling. Her daughter joined them at the table, already reaching for the materials. Are we making more? We're always making more, Susan said. The girl nodded, satisfied. Jason watched as Susan guided her through the process, adjusting, explaining, correcting with patience that felt natural now. There was no doubt in her voice anymore. No hesitation in her hands. She wasn't learning from him anymore. She had learned. Carl's voice drifted from the porch chair where he was stationed, legs still elevated but his expression far less irritated than it had been weeks ago. Looks like I'm going to have to start charging rent for that workshop, he called. Susan glanced over. You can't even get up to collect it. Carl pointed a finger at her. That doesn't mean I won't calculate it. Margaret stepped out behind him, shaking her head. Ignore him. He's jealous the plants are contributing more than he is. I contribute wisdom, Carl argued. You contribute commentary, she corrected. Jason chuckled, but his attention shifted back to Susan. You've got everything lined up, he said quietly, so only she could hear. I do, she replied. And? She set down the piece she was working on and turned to face him fully. And I want you in it, she said. Jason didn't react immediately, at least not visibly. You're already part of this, he said. That's not what I mean. He held her gaze, waiting. I don't want this to just be something I built, she said. I want it to be something we grow. The distinction mattered. He considered her carefully. What would that look like to you? He asked. She smiled faintly. Like you don't stand off to the side anymore. Jason exhaled softly, something thoughtful passing through his expression. I stayed back for a reason, he said. I know, she replied. And I needed that. She stepped closer. But I don't need it now. The quiet between them shifted. Not uncertain, not fragile. Resolved. Jason nodded once. All right, he said. That was it. No hesitation. No negotiation. Just the same certainty he always carried, now extended forward instead of held back. Susan smiled, something warm and steady settling into place. Good, she said. That afternoon they worked side by side, but differently. Jason didn't just suggest anymore. He joined. Measuring, mixing, helping refine processes where it made sense, but always in a way that complemented, never overtook. Susan noticed. She also noticed how easily it fit. Hold on, she said at one point, adjusting a ratio he was about to use. We use slightly less water now. Jason paused, then nodded. Got it. No resistance. No ego. Just adaptation. Their rhythm aligned quickly, natural, seamless. Her daughter looked between them. You guys work like a team. Susan glanced at Jason briefly before answering. Yeah, she said. We do. Her son looked up from his own project. Does that mean we get more money? Jason considered that carefully. Eventually. That's good enough, the boy said. As the day wore on and the sunlight softened into evening, the table filled again with neat rows of finished cones and carefully shaped holders. More than before. Better than before. Susan wiped her hands and stepped back, taking it all in. This is just the beginning, she said quietly. Jason stood beside her, following her gaze. Yeah, he agreed. She turned to him. Are you sure you're okay with this? She asked. Everything that comes with it? He didn't need to ask what she meant. Growth, work, responsibility, life. I told you, he said, his voice calm but unwavering. I'm all in. She searched his face, as if looking for even a hint of doubt. There wasn't any. She smiled, the kind that didn't fade quickly. All right, she said. Jason nodded once. All right. Behind them, the quiet of the rural road stretched out as it always had, steady, unchanged. But in the space they built together, everything was moving forward. Not rushed, not forced, just growing. And for both of them, that was exactly what they wanted. Epilogue. Pine and light. 1 year later, the air felt fuller somehow. Not heavier, never that, but full in the way a place becomes when it has been lived in honestly. The Jameson backyard, once just a stretch of grass leading into trees, had transformed into something else entirely. There were clear paths now, worn in by footsteps that carried purpose. The greenhouse stood brighter, fuller, its glass panes gleaming with the quiet pride of constant use. And beyond it all, pine and light wasn't just an idea anymore. It was real. Susan stood at the edge of the yard that afternoon, arms loosely folded, watching as her children darted between tables set up for the cookout. Laughter rose easily, blending with the hum of conversation from family and friends who had all gathered for what Jason had insisted was just to get together. She wasn't fooled. Susan Jameson wasn't a woman who missed patterns, and for the last month, Jason had been careful in the way someone was careful when they were hiding something worth revealing. The trips in and out of his garage, the quiet conversations with her father, the way her mother suddenly knew when to distract her. It all added up. She just didn't know to what. And surprisingly, she was fine with that. You're doing it again, Jason said, appearing at her side like he had a habit of doing. She glanced at him. Thinking. Plotting, he corrected. She smiled. I'm allowed to be curious. You are, he agreed. Just not allowed to ruin the surprise. Her eyes narrowed slightly. So there is a surprise. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached down and took her hand. Simple, steady, as natural as breathing. Come with me, he said. Something in his voice shifted the air around them. Not dramatic, just certain. Susan didn't resist. She let him lead her away from the crowd, past the familiar stretch where the yard met the tree line, and into the quiet space between their two homes. The sounds of the party dulled, replaced by something softer, more personal. Jason stopped, turning to face her fully. For a moment, he just looked at her, and she looked back. Jason, she said, softer now. What's going on? He smiled, not wide, not nervous, just real. I love you, he said. No preamble, no build-up. The words settled exactly where they belonged. Susan felt her chest tighten, not from surprise, but from recognition. I know, she said quietly. And I want to be a part of your life, he continued. All of it. The good parts, the hard parts, the parts that don't make sense yet. He paused, letting that sit. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, not lifting it dramatically, not dropping to one knee. He simply held it out in his open hand, offering instead of asking, like he always had. No pressure, no expectation, just choice. I'm not here to take anything from you, he said. I'm here because I want to build something with you, for as long as you want me there. Susan stared at the ring for only a second before looking back up at him. Her answer had never been uncertain. Yes, she said, not because she needed him, but because she wanted him, because somewhere in the steady presence of his patience, his belief in her, and the way he never tried to take what she hadn't freely given, she had chosen him just as surely. Jason exhaled something that was almost a laugh, relief mixing with joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that felt grounding and complete all at once. Behind her, unseen, Carl Jameson raised both arms in silent triumph. Jason, without breaking the hug, lifted his hand just enough to give a small thumbs up over Susan's shoulder. Carl responded exactly as expected. He danced, not gracefully, not with rhythm, with enthusiasm. Margaret covered her mouth, laughing softly as she started ushering people toward the side of the house, whispering just loudly enough to gather attention. Susan leaned back slightly, catching the movement from the corner of her eye. What? She started, glancing behind her. Jason gently turned her attention back to him. I'll be yours, he said, his voice quiet but steady. For as long as you want me. The simplicity of it hit harder than anything elaborate ever could have. Susan smiled, warmth spreading through her. That's a long time, she said. Good, he replied. Then, after a brief pause, he added, I have something for you. She laughed softly. Of course you do. But this one, he said, glancing past her toward his house. Everyone helped with. That made her pause. Jason. He just nodded toward the garage. Come on. The door rolled open slowly. Jason stepped aside, his hand gesturing for her to go first. Susan hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. And stopped. The space barely resembled what it had been a year ago. Where there had once been scattered tools and unused corners, there was now structure, intentional, thoughtful, built with purpose. Stations lined one side of the garage, each one clearly defined. There was an assembly line that stretched organically from one end to the other, starting with a compact wood chipper set into a sturdy frame, perfectly positioned for processing pine cones. Beyond it, a series of grinders followed, aligned neatly like pieces of a system that had found its rhythm. And at the far end, a machine Susan recognized instantly, though transformed. Is that? She whispered. A paint shaker, Carl's voice said proudly as he stepped in behind her. Repurposed. Makes a hell of a sifter. She turned, stunned. Her father stood straighter than he had in months, pride written plainly across his face. You built this? She asked. With help, he said, nodding toward Jason. Jason lifted a shoulder. He outdid me. Susan looked back at the space. There was a drying room enclosed along the rear wall, perfectly ventilated. Shelving units housed neatly organized materials, pine, herbs, flowers, all categorized and ready for use. And then she saw it. The office, set just off the main workspace, framed with clean lines and bright lighting. It stood as something separate but connected. The tiled ceiling reflected the fluorescent lights evenly, giving it a professional clarity that hadn't existed anywhere in her life before. Her mother stepped forward quietly. I picked the colors, Margaret said almost casually. Figured if you hated them, paint's cheap. Susan didn't move right away. She walked into the office slowly, her hand brushing against the smooth surface of the desk, then the wall, then the window. The view stopped her. From that spot, she could see straight into her parents' backyard. The greenhouse standing steady and full of life, framed perfectly as if it had always been meant to be seen from exactly there. On the door, polished and unmistakable, a brass nameplate gleamed. Susan Cornell, CEO of Pine and Light LLC. She swallowed hard, emotion rising too quickly to hide. This, she started, her voice catching slightly, This is yours, Jason said gently from behind her. She turned, eyes brighter now. You did this, she said. We did this, he corrected, nodding toward her parents, her son, even Lila standing quietly near the back. Susan's son puffed up immediately. I helped. You supervised, Carl added. That counts, the boy insisted. Jason grinned. It absolutely does. Susan let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as she turned back toward the space. Her space. Everything she'd built. Every step, every decision, every moment of doubt pushed through, stood here now. Not as something fragile, but as something solid. Real. She turned back to Jason, stepping toward him. This is more than I ever imagined, she said. He nodded. You aimed higher than you realized. She reached for his hand. Thank you, she said. Jason shook his head slightly. You earned it. That mattered more. Around them, the room filled with the quiet hum of people who cared. Family, friends, witnesses not just to a moment, but to a journey. Susan looked at them all, then back at Jason. 1 year ago, she had been standing still, trying to figure out how to move forward. Now she was building a life, and she knew exactly who she was building it with.